So the kind of two aspects of Goryos is the threats they play and the interaction they have. Some people might look at Goryos and they'll say, oh, it's going to be a slower matchup. They have a lot of interaction, Thoughtseize, Force of Negation, etc. But at the same time, they can be very fast because if they get a quick Goryos, the game is basically over at that point. You can't win. So you can't just sit there like a traditional control deck going draw go. I mean, you could compare it to the famous Splinter Twin, for example, where they have interaction to slow you down, but they can also just kill you on the very quickly if you let them untap. Um, but notably, something about Goryo's is that the way Storm is built, Storm has almost no interaction for the threats. Like Storm doesn't really play interaction for Goryo's Mending. You don't play discard, you don't play counter spells, you don't play graveyard hate, etc. So if you play against Goryo's, they could mulligan to 5, mulligan to 4, and just Goryo's you on turn 3 and kill you. What I'm trying to say is that like they're part of what's powerful about their deck against you is leaning into their threats actually. Like they should be kind of leaning into their threats because you don't have interaction. And this will tie into Frog a bit later when I talk about sideboarding and prismatic ending and stuff like that. But that's the thing to know is that they can actually kill you very quickly. So you kind of want to put pressure on them to try and make it so that they don't have time to cast a Faithful Mending, or just know that you can't just sit there forever doing nothing. You need to put some pressure on. Obviously, if they have a fast Goryos with interaction, it's going to be hard for anybody to win. That's what people say. But it's worth keeping in mind again that their Goryos, they should like out of their entire matchup spread, this is probably one of their best matchups for Goryos. Storm has again literally no interaction for it. They should be leaning into their Goryos as much as possible. Whereas in other matchups, sometimes they might trim Goryos, they might side it out, or maybe it's not important for whatever reason. But as we'll get into, as I'll talk about the matchup more, you'll see that Goryos is very important for them because basically what I'll say is people will say, oh, they have a lot of interaction, but they're not. If you notice all their interaction, you might notice a common thread between all these if you think about it. So, like, what's the kind of interaction they play? Solitude, counter spells, Thoughtseize, Graveyard Hate, maybe, Nile Spellbomb. Here's kind of the typical Goryo's list. You can see that's what people tend to play. Maybe Surgical, they might side in, whatever. Yeah, so think about what's the common thread of all these interaction. None of them are good against Ral on the stack when the Storm player has mana up to threaten flipping it. In the sense that like if they can't just Solitude your Ral. This is what I've noticed from playing the matchup. They have a lot of interaction, but almost all their interaction is bad against Ral on the stack. Thoughtseize obviously can hit Ral, but again, I'm saying when Ral is on the stack, they're pretty bad at dealing with it. So if the game goes on, as long as you have resources, you just cast Ral and then you cast spells, and it's like pretty hard for them to win. So they kind of need to actually pressure you reasonably quickly because if the game drags on too much, that will happen. Even though theoretically, if they're the control deck, then theoretically the control deck should have the better late game. But that's not really the way the matchup is, in my opinion. And Rel's probably one of your most important cards that you should lead into and be very aware of the fact that they're not very good at interacting with Rel. And like I said, Goryo's, they're very good at their Goryo's is very good in the matchup against you because you have no interaction. Likewise, for Storm, Ral's not always your most important card. It's not always your best card, but against Goryo's, it is very important. You want to lean into it. They're very weak to it. So they should be trying to lean into their Goryo's. You should be trying to lean into your Ral. Um, and we'll talk about that for a bit. The reason I have Strike It Rich here, that's not a card that everybody plays, though I overheard, I didn't talk to anybody from the Boulder, for people who know that team, has a lot of good players, like Andy Garcia, Romo, etc. Um, I heard some of them say after the PT that, if they played Storm again, they might play more Strike It Rich. I played 2 Strike It Rich at the PT. It wasn't really for Goryo's specifically, it was more for other decks. But something worth noting is that Strike It Rich is the kind of card that I noticed, like part of what made me more interested in it is Solitude's was the most played card in the format before the PT, I think. And I noticed it's very important to play Ral. Like if you can play Ral with 2 mana up, like if you play Ral and you have more mana, then it's like extremely good against like Solitude decks. So I guess I would say you don't necessarily want to side out your Strike It Riches if you play it, because even though they have a lot of interaction, sometimes the fact that they have like Thoughtseizes and stuff just means you don't have stuff to do, so you can just be flashing back your Strike It Rich, trying to set up your Ral. So it helps you play towards your Ral. And compared to like Pyretic Rituals, for example, the difference is if you Pyretic Ritual and then play Ral, now you're kind of committed to the Ral flipping, where Strike It Rich, you can just play it, not be as committed. Anyway, won't talk about that too much, and obviously there's some similarities between Pyretic Ritual and Strike It Rich and their ability to let you play Ral with mana up. So basically, now we'll talk about the threats a bit. So you can notice the threats in the deck. They have Goryo's Faithful Mending, and then they all play Psychic Frog, Some of them play Quantum Riddler or Philology Archaeologist um, with Ephemerate. That's kind of another plan they have. And something I noticed, like some people will be like, "Oh, should we side in Prismatic Ending for Psychic Frog?" And yeah, if your opponent plays like High Noon or Damping Sphere, Deafening Silence, then that's a whole other situation. Then sure, maybe you want some Prismatic Endings to deal with those cards. But assuming your opponent's playing a default list and they don't have a High Noon or something of the sort, um, then I think that if you think it through, Prismatic Ending's pretty awkward. Because again, look at the threats they have in the deck. They have, let's say, three primary threats: Goryos, Riddler, Frog. So what does Prismatic Ending work? Against one third of their threats. It works against Frog. Okay, so it doesn't work against when they're going for Faithful Mending. It doesn't work when they're going for Riddler. It only works against Frog. And also, famously, if you remove a Frog, they could just discard the Atraxa. And that might sound kind of like a meme. It's like, oh, if they have it all, blah, blah, blah. But if you think about it, um, if the, like, if they're just hitting you as Frog, like what I'm trying to say is like if they don't have Goryos, the Frog is much more manageable to beat because the Frog will take some time to win the game. Obviously, you don't want to get hit with the Frog, and if they have a bunch of interaction in Frog, it's good against you. But what I mean to say is if they hit you as a Frog and you're just casting Hex Magic, Rends Resolves, whatever, or getting to your Ral, you can beat the Frog. I guess what I'm trying to say is that like if you're gonna Prismatic Ending the Frog and they don't have an Atraxa in hand, then like what I'm trying to say is that their scariest threat is Atraxa. So Prismatic Ending doesn't even deal with the scariest threat. And even some of the times when it does hit Frog, it won't even work for it properly if they can just discard an Atraxa anyway. So yeah, I mean, I would not be like, oh, they're a Frog deck, I need my Prismatic Endings. I mean, yeah, you could consider it if you want, but again, just keep in mind, pointless versus Riddler, pointless versus Faithful Mending almost. Um, and just keep in mind that like Goryo's is so by far the best threat. You have no interaction for it, and Frog is just drawing one card a turn. I mean, if you cast one Rends Resolve a turn, it's keeping up with it. Okay, so you're not going to lose the game instantly. And again, if they do have Atraxa, then you'd lose the game instantly anyway. And so yeah, I probably wouldn't mess around with Prismatic Ending that much, but obviously you can if you want, whatever. Yeah, and then you can see the kind of interaction they have. Obviously, I'm not saying you should always sandbag your Ral until turn 4. Sometimes you don't have any play, like maybe your hand's all Hex Magics or slow. Maybe you want to play at the Ral. Maybe you have multiple Rals, whatever. I guess another thing to keep in mind when you're playing the matchup is that Faithful Mending being an instant can kind of mean that often when they pass with interaction, you might want to play cards into it so that it's harder for them to use a Mending. Like let's say your opponent, you have a Ruby and they could have Consign up and you're like, oh, I don't want to play Ruby because what if they Consign it? And you could be like, well, then maybe you give them a chance to cast a Faithful Mending. Maybe you give them a chance to Surveil, and also is it going to get better for you for holding it? Like usually Ruby is one of the most important cards in your deck, but in this matchup, because you're playing so much to Ral, sometimes if you think you'll have access to a Ral or another Ruby, it's not that bad to play it into Consign, get it consigned. Yeah, I guess that's probably most of it. I'll just think for a moment if there's anything else I want to say, but mostly I would say, yeah, they're kind of a Splinter Twin deck. Like, yes, they have a lot of interaction, but they can just kill you on the third turn. They should probably mulligan reasonably aggressively because even if they have a 5-card hand with the combo, you're going to lose. Obviously, their deck's not that consistent at doing the combo, but again, when people say that, it's like on a spectrum of matchups, and Storm is like one of the best possible matchups for Goryo's. Once again, you have no interaction for it, and it finds them all their interaction. A lot of their interactions like mismatchy. It's not easy to beat Storm by just casting Thoughtseize and a Solitude. They really need the threats to back it up, and obviously Riddler is not as impressive against you. And yeah, so I guess that's most of what I would say. I mean, there's things you can say about like, oh, should you keep a slower hand? Like sometimes people will be like, oh, they have a lot of Thoughtseizes. Should I keep a hand that can't really win, but has spells? And yeah, I mean, I would say I'm not saying that you should mulligan to try and kill them on turn 3 to race them comboing because they have more. They're more likely to have 1 or 2 interaction cards than they are to have a turn 3 Goryos, right? I'm just trying to say that you shouldn't approach the matchup assuming that it's a traditional control deck, and yeah, like obviously mulliganing and Thoughtseize and all these interaction spells is kind of an interesting thing because there's kind of the class like if your hand's not that good, then you're like, oh, my hand's not that good against Thoughtseize, but it's like, oh, mulliganing's also not that good against Thoughtseize, but like I'd say yeah, I would say in this matchup, yeah, you would lean to like when you look at Storm hands, usually in the dark generically, you're like you almost needed your hand to be able to kill on turn 3 because your opponent's almost going to be 100%. Like if you're playing Modern, you play against Prowess, you play against whatever deck, you should kind of assume that you're going to die on the third turn in Modern, so you should tend to mulligan for a turn 3 kill. But against Goryos, they're not likely to kill you on the third turn unless they have exactly a Traxa. So you can keep hands that are like not going to present a turn 3 kill. Like if you have a hand that's like 2 lands, like triple Ren's Resolve, and some random other spell. I don't know what it is. Like, yeah, I would tend to keep those kind of hands against Goryos that are like turn 4, turn 5 win, that can win turn 4 or turn 5 past an interaction or two. But, you don't want to keep a hand that's like 5 lands and like a past in flames and be like, oh yeah, this is good against control, because that's just not really realistic. Like, they're going to play a frog on turn 2 and you're going to die. So it's more like, I would see the range more as like, yeah, if your hand can win on like turn 4, turn 5, maybe even, turn 6, but it like, if your hand's just like a lot of card draw, I guess is what I'm trying to say. In a lot of matchups, you might be like, oh, I can't keep a hand of all card draw because, you need to be faster. But against Goryos, it's more respectable. Like, again, I'm not saying you should mull to beat Goryos on turn 3 because your win rate's just going to be low against it anyway, but it's just keeping in mind that's something they should be aiming to do. And that's why, like, caring about their frog doesn't matter as much as you might think. Or, like, sometimes you just need to be aggressive and slam cards so that they don't have time to cast their mending. They're forced to interact. That's most of it. Also, I guess I would say, like, even though traditionally, historically, Past in Flames is good against 1-for-1 decks, since they play like 2 to 3 Force of Negations and sometimes Nile Spell Bombs, usually just one though. Uh, it's a card that honestly I would consider siding out. I mean, I would also probably, because of Surgical, I would probably side in Stormscale Scion if I have it, so they can't just Surgical your wish. That's most of it. And I'm not saying, I don't have Prismatic ending up here to say, oh, you shouldn't play your Ruby Medallion into your ending, because it's not necessarily a bad play. Like, let's say you play Ruby Medallion, and then they ending it, that means maybe they couldn't play a frog, maybe they couldn't play a mending. So it kind of depends on their hand. Obviously, a common play pattern sometimes you want to set up is you want to play Ruby and then immediately cast an Impulse, so you get to lock in the discount value at least. But because they have consign, sometimes if they're tapped out, like they go turn 1 surveil land go, then it might be a solid chance to play Ruby, because then they may not be able to consign it. That's, yeah, so I guess that's all I have to say about the matchup. I think it's pretty close, probably slightly unfavored, but my win rate was not bad in it, because I think I had a, with all this in mind, you might have a slightly better understanding of what matters in the matchup than your opponent. Again, you're leaning into Ral, they should be leaning into their Goryos. Sometimes they get kind of nervous, they try and play too controlly, they try and spam a lot of interaction, but they kind of actually need to apply pressure because it's very hard for them to interact with Ral. And again, I'm not saying you should always sandbag Ral, but it's just a very powerful maneuver that you can try and set up and keep in mind. Yeah.